Today, we journey into the past by way of the book of Revelation. We seek to learn from moments in history that bear similarities to our own to gain a fuller picture about what we discussed yesterday in New York City. Will history repeat itself? And if it does, is that good or bad? All that and more today on Something's Happening Here. I'm Steve Hicks, and welcome. Welcome back, friends. Happy Tuesday if you are watching this as we broadcast it. And today's kind of like a part two to yesterday. We started in New York City looking at a statement by Mayor Eric Adams regarding his kind of faith position on what's going on over there. Specifically, he talked about prayer being removed from public schools and then inevitably being replaced by guns and how that's a negative turn of events. So today we want to go back in time, but we want to do it grounded in the scriptures. So I actually want to look in Revelation chapter 2, and that's going to require some more words, right? If you are not already very familiar with Revelation chapters 2 and 3, which are collectively known as the seven churches, then I need to give you some sort of introduction before we look at it. This is a big show, so I'm going to go fast, and thank goodness you're watching this on the internet where you can rewind if necessary. Okay, the seven churches are generally understood by Bible scholars, so to speak. And I say that because if you put 100 people in the room and ask them what they mean, you probably get 100 different answers. So I'm limiting the data set to Bible scholars, people who take this really seriously and put an academic effort into studying these things out. So there is generally an approach to understanding these prophecies that that mirrors the prophecies to Christian history. So, for example, there are seven different churches in these two chapters, and it's helpful to recognize that they represent seven distinct eras of Christian history, from the first coming of Christ until the second coming of Christ. And there's obviously a lot more to say about that, but that's a pretty good skeleton to start in. And therefore, when we look at one of the seven churches in just a moment here, what we're really doing is looking at God's way of describing a specific era of Christian history. And that way we can go to the historical record of that period of time and see how it is similar to what we talked about yesterday, see how that ultimately was good and bad, and see how that could manifest itself again in our modern day. So, please open your Bibles with me to Revelation chapter 2. Just so you have it, because we don't have time to do it on this 15-minute format, I am putting in the comments an article from ministrymagazine.org called Pulpit and Study, The Prophecy of the Seven Churches. And it is a pretty good exposition of what I just said to you, the whole mirroring eras of Christian history thing. So that is for your further study if you want to. I believe it was written in 1950. So it's an old article, but the Bible hasn't changed since 1950, so the data here is still good. In any case, in Revelation chapter 2, we are going to be looking at, starting in verse 12, the message to the church in Pergamos. So this is the third of the seven churches. We started in Ephesus, then we went to Smyrna, and then the third one is Pergamos. Verse 12 says, "To the angel of the church in Pergamos write, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword." So that means Jesus. So the words of Jesus to this church in verse 13 are, "I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is." So yikes, from the very beginning, we recognize that Jesus is talking to his church. He's talking to his people. And yet he's saying, I know where you are. You're in a bad place. You have chosen to live, right? The word is dwell. I know where you dwell. You have chosen to live where Satan keeps his throne. They are cohabiting with the devil. And Jesus, he has not given up on them. He loves his people. He loves his church. But he's here to tell them they're on the wrong track and why and what to do about it. So, and the latter part of verse 13, he continues and says, "And you hold fast to my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." And so that's telling us that whenever we are looking to find a fulfillment here, it's going to follow a time of persecution, right? Because Jesus is remembering. He's helping them to remember that even in this difficult time of persecution, when his people were being martyred, they still held fast to his name. They did not deny the name of Christ, even during that difficult time. So that's two clues already, right? The church has moved toward the devil, and in a period of time that follows persecution. Verse 14, Jesus says, "But I have a few things against you, because you have there," where Satan dwells, "you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality." There's a lot in that verse, man. Okay. Who are Balaam and Balak? Well, these characters come from the book of Numbers, and Numbers 22, 3, and 4, I think, off the top of my head. Balaam was a prophet of God, but he was not an Israelite prophet of God. And so he seemed to have this relationship that was well known in that land, where he received words from God. So Balak was a pagan, non-Israelite king, just like a secular king. And he was very much afraid of and an enemy of the children of Israel. So he hires Balaam, whom he knows is a prophet of God. He hires Balaam to curse Israel. But in those few chapters, although Balaam wants to do it because he's more in love with the money that Balak is offering him than he is with the God who speaks to him, despite wanting the money and wanting to curse Israel, he cannot, because he is bound to the words that God gave him. So he goes 4 times to try to do it and comes back every single time saying, "Sorry, I can only say what God has given me to say." So in those few chapters, Balaam seems like a good guy. He seems like maybe his heart is wrong, but his actions are correct, and he's ultimately doing what God says to do. Later on in the story, he turns specifically wicked and is responsible for a lot of corruption coming into Israel. And in the New Testament, he is condemned for that reason. So his ultimate fate is not on the side of God, but at least in those chapters of the book of Numbers, he seems to have a loyalty to God that outweighs his loyalty to money. And by the way, just as a note, Balaam is also from where Talking Donkey International gets its name, right? Because in that story, God speaks to Balaam through the donkey which he is riding. So that's a really interesting story. You want to go check that out from Numbers 22 and 3, probably, or I don't know exactly where, but it's in that section. So when Jesus is using these figures to speak to the church at Pergamos, what he is saying is ultimately that Balaam, who represents the church in a corrupt kind of a way, the non-Israelite church, is becoming involved with the state, right? The secular powers. So that's another clue, right? We're looking for a period of time in which the church is moving in the direction of Satan or demonic principles. It follows a period of intense persecution, and the real problem is the intermingling of the church and the state coming together, Balaam and Balak coming together. Even the note about enticing them to sexual immorality has a prophetic meaning, because sex in Revelation is almost never actually sex. It's talking about involvement with women, but women are representative of churches. So sexual immorality is the church, the woman behaving in an improper way, right? Having a boyfriend who is not Jesus. And then lastly, in verse 15, Jesus says, "Thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. Repent, or else I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Nicolaitans, I'm gonna have something on the screen. I'll send it to the producer, so you're probably looking at it right now. It is an etymology of the word Nicolaitans, and what we're seeing is that it ultimately talks about being kind of lording over the people, right? Exalted above the people. It's just the etymological root of that word. So all of that together, where the church and the state are coming together in a way that lords itself over the common people, following intense persecution, moving away from godly principles towards demonic principles. When could that be? Well, I'm going to tell you it is the Constantinian era of the Roman Empire. Right? It was immediately following the Diocletian Edict, which was the worst persecution the church has ever faced. And that is when Constantine the emperor inserted Christianity into the Roman Empire as the official religion. So church and state were coming together. And there were a lot of pagan principles that were introduced into the church during that time. So we see the doctrines of the devils, all of that. Like, Jesus is pointing us to that moment in time. So what happened in that moment of time? Was it positive or negative? Well, it seems to be negative, right? If Jesus is condemning it. But humanity and history are never really that straightforward, are they? So here is an article from Classical Latin School Association talking about Constantine's vision of the cross on this day in 312 AD. The story goes, and you can read more about it in the article, the story goes that Constantine was in a battle with a contender to be the emperor over all of Rome. And on a fateful day at a bridge, what's the name of the bridge? Millview Bridge, thank you. He had a vision, so goes the story, a vision in the sky of Jesus presenting his banner and saying, you will have victory if you fight under this banner. And so as a result of that vision, Constantine says, okay, I'm a Christian because you've promised me victory. He goes on to achieve a military victory, becomes the emperor, and says, it was Jesus who did this for me, therefore we're all Christians now. Very much like Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament, right? I have made this religious decision, so now it's everybody's religious decision. Yeah. So that's probably not good to force religion with the power of the state, but good things came of it. There was a relative peace against the church, right? Prior to the 10 years prior to this were just mayhem and bloodshed against the church. Now the church could live in peace. Here's another article about Saint Telemachus from CatholicReadings.org. And there's not much here, but it does tell us about Saint Telemachus, whose story is that he was a Catholic monk who was attending, or at least somehow aware of, a gladiator competition where men were pitted against each other to the death. And he was so horrified at this that he says, like, forbear, and he demands that it end. It does not go over well, and he is martyred in that very moment. He's stoned to death by some accounts, and I've read that he is fed to the gladiators. They murder him in that capacity, but he dies one way or another. But the legend goes that the people, or the sitting emperor, I guess, at that time, was so horrified by his martyrdom that he outlaws gladiator games from that point forward. So without this Catholic monk having an exalted position the way he did, then gladiator games, in theory, would have continued. And so the insertion of Christianity into the Roman Empire brought about positive changes, like the ending of gladiator games, like the invention of hospitals. I mean, we can go on and on. There are many positive things. But it wasn't all positive, was it? Especially if you were aware of our study of Daniel chapter 7, way back in our episode called God's Rottweiler, we realize a lot of evil and wickedness came out of that time. that Middle Ages time when the church and the state did not have any daylight between them because they were now one entity. It was horrific persecution. So much so that the sitting pope today has apologized for it. It was that bad. And so what I am trying to show us today is that maybe Mayor Adams is going to succeed at having some sort of like revival and remembering godly principles in the way the city is run and the larger culture around him. Maybe he will succeed, and maybe it will even look positive. Maybe we will see a reduction in gun violence or some other positive thing. But if history is any indication, it seems that any positive thing that comes will ultimately be swallowed up and eclipsed by negative things that come after, right? As the Christian powers ultimately get drunk on the power of the state, only evil can come from that. Jesus never once appealed to the power of the Romans. Never once. That was not his ministry. He was not interested in secular power at all. And his church should also not be interested in secular power, because only wickedness comes. Whew, yeah, that was a big show, wasn't it? And now I'm going to call you to be subscribed because we still have 3 more days to go. Make sure you have liked the Facebook page and changed your notifications. Make sure you have subscribed to Talking Donkey International YouTube channel and also hit your notification bell. Make sure you have followed the Something's Happening Here Rumble channel. Make sure you have joined the Something's Happening Here Locals channel. And if you watch us on talkingdonkeyinternational.org, go to the podcast page and bookmark it. Thank you so much for being here. We're really just getting started, so come on back tomorrow. I'm Steve Hicks, and this is Something's Happening Here.